The Black Box Archive. Story 1. The Integrity Protocol. The systems you trust to isolate the madness will always be the first to inherit its contagion. Serafina Varga was the kind of person who viewed a data center as a sacred space, a cool, quiet vault where the chaotic mess of human life could be codified, secured, and understood. She had arrived at her small office, Veritas Data Solutions, which sat amidst a sprawling, sun-baked complex of metal fabrication shops and logistics hubs around mid-afternoon on a stifling Tuesday in the middle of October. The office was on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. That morning had been ordinary, filled with mundane work like recovering a deleted presentation for a tax firm and archiving a mountain of old emails. The trouble started not with a hack, but with a delivery. An hour after she arrived, a dull gray service van, the kind driven by men who fade into the background, pulled up to the loading bay. Sarah heard a polite, anonymous knock on the inner door. She paused her work, noting the time on the corner of her screen, which read just past 3 in the afternoon. She opened the door to find the courier, a bland man in a cheap, unbranded uniform, silently holding a medium-sized, heavy box. The man simply waited, expressionless, until she signed the digital tablet. She noted nothing about him, not his eyes, not his scent, only the utter neutrality of his presence. He was gone a moment later, folding himself back into the gray van, which then disappeared down the street. It was a perfectly professional exchange. Inside the box were 3 matte black, solid-state drives. They were unmarked, impossibly smooth, and felt unnaturally cold to the touch. The only piece of identifying information was a strip of brown packing tape wound around the box and half-shredded beneath it, a tiny label bearing the name of the anonymous sender, Mrs. Helen Vane, and an address in London. Sarah felt a flicker of professional curiosity. The sheer anonymity of the objects violated every shipping protocol she knew. She placed the first drive on the desk of her most secure, air-gapped forensic workstation, a heavy machine nicknamed the Citadel because it was built to withstand anything. The Citadel sat on a thick, anti-static mat in a server room chilled to an Arctic temperature. Sarah connected the first drive at exactly 4:20 in the afternoon. The system recognized the drive's presence in less than a second, a speed which was already abnormal. The system didn't just crash, it evaporated. The operating system's kernel, the core of the entire machine, disintegrated in what felt like a single, violent exhale. There was no error code, no blue screen, just a blindingly fast cascade of white noise that lasted only for the space of one drawn breath. Then came the sound. It was a single, piercing metallic shriek, impossibly high, a sound that seemed to originate not from the speakers, but from the very structure of the building. Her ears rang instantly, and she clutched the sides of her head, staggering back against the cold wall. The sound lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet it felt like it had hollowed out her skull. Sarah spent the next hour, until 5:30, running triage. She found nothing. The Citadel was dead, the internal components fried beyond recovery. A colleague in a neighboring logistics firm later called her, half-jokingly, to ask if she'd dropped a massive hydraulic press because a sharp, non-tectonic tremor had registered on a local sensor array at precisely the time of the shriek. Fear, cold and clinical, replaced her initial shock. Sarah knew what malware looked like. She could read a corrupted file like a doctor reads an X-ray. This was something else. This was a physical contagion carried on a digital medium. Her first move was to reach out to her contact, Molly, a former colleague and friend in the industry who now operated as an intelligence relay. Sarah sent an encrypted message detailing the exact characteristics of the digital meltdown and the physical phenomenon it caused, finishing the transmission just after 7 that evening. The reply was brief and brutal. "They are coming. 48 hours. Don't let them have it. The threat was now real, no longer just a digital ghost. Sarah walked back into her office to look at the 2 remaining black drives. She had to find the human source, the explanation, before the people Molly warned her about arrived. She picked up the packaging again, finally tearing off the brown tape. The small, semi-shredded label underneath was clearer now. Mrs. Helen Vane, London. She needed to find out who this woman was and why she would mail a digital weapon across a continent. Sarah noticed something new on the matte surface of the second drive, a faint, almost invisible scratch. She angled the drive under the focused beam of her forensic lamp. There, etched microscopically into the casing, was a simple, 3-pronged glyph. It wasn't decorative. It looked like a tiny, perfect, 3-legged asterisk, a mark of ownership or origin. As she stared at the drive, trying to categorize the symbol, she felt a profound sense of temporal distortion, as if the moment had stretched thin and fragile. She looked down at the silent, black object in her hands, realizing that in less than 4 hours, her world had transitioned from solid ground to an impossible ticking clock. She looked at her empty server room, the Citadel, a smoking, useless corpse in the corner. She knew that the object had not been defeated. It had simply waited for a new host. The true horror of the situation was the knowledge that she could trust her own eyes, but she could no longer trust the physics that made the world obey them. Story 2. The Logic of Null. 44 hours after the sonic event in Reno, the logical mind began to accept the invasion as a necessary truth. Dr. Elias Thorne, a man who saw the human world as a vast, inefficient algorithm, had spent the 44 hours since the central event in a state of intellectual intoxication. It was mid-afternoon on Thursday, 2 days after the incident, and he was working in the main reading room of the Warburg Institute in the Bloomsbury area of London, United Kingdom. The institute was quiet, filled with the comforting scent of leather bindings and old paper, a world away from the kind of events that now consumed his attention. His contact, Molly, had forwarded him the raw audio and observational data, Sarah's desperate early evening message from Reno. Elias had been recruited by a clandestine agency purely for his esoteric knowledge of non-human language structures. He viewed the data not as evidence of a disaster, but as a specimen. He played the audio on repeat through noise-canceling headphones, the metallic shriek, a sound which, when analyzed, occupied a frequency band analogous to the collision of massive, cold bodies in space. It was the sound of a linguistic singularity, a point where the rules of communication fundamentally break down. The technical readout from the dead workstation showed an unprecedented event. The computer's operating system didn't simply fail. It was instantaneously rewritten into a complete, non-semantic language, a code that described nothing. Elias described it in his notes as a perfect, self-contained description of the non-existent. As he studied the microscopic image of the symbol, the 3-pronged glyph etched into the drive casing that Sarah had discovered, he became increasingly obsessed. The symbol appeared to be a null operator, a grammatical construct that meant, ignore all that precedes this. If this was true, the 3 drives were not data storage, but 3 distinct statements of negation. Around 7 in the evening, he was analyzing a grainy CCTV feed that Molly had sent, tracing the courier, the man in the gray van, as the vehicle meandered through a residential London suburb. The man had driven the van to a quiet, tree-lined street in the affluent area of Hampstead High Street. The footage was poor, but Elias noticed a faint spray-painted mark on a nearby lamppost. He used computational enhancement to stabilize the image. It was the symbol, the 3-pronged glyph. He recognized the location as being close to the address of the anonymous sender, Mrs. Helen Vane. This confirmation, the linguistic void now mapped onto physical geography, produced a physical reaction that had been building for the last 2 days. The high-pitched shriek of the drive, which he'd heard only in recordings, was now playing softly, steadily, within his inner ear. He felt it not as sound, but as an acute, vibrating pressure centered just behind his molars. It felt like a small metallic splinter had been lodged into his jawbone. He knew, clinically, that this was psychosomatic, a direct response to the stress. He left the institute shortly before 8, taking the tube back to his small, sterile flat in Bloomsbury, London, United Kingdom. He sat down at his kitchen table, reviewing his notes, the metallic whine growing louder in his perception, louder than the evening traffic outside or the sounds of his downstairs neighbors preparing their dinner. It was a silent, internal, unrelenting protest. Elias began to grind his teeth, pushing his jaw to the point of pain, trying to use brute mechanical force to dislodge the non-existent splinter. The grinding, he rationalized, was simply an attempt to realign the jaw's mechanics, but it quickly became something else. It became an obsessive, physical ritual, a desperate attempt to destroy the foreign object that had taken root in his sensory reality. He was attempting to chew the frequency out of his own head. He spent the rest of the night alternating between meticulous analysis of the symbol's coordinates and the painful, focused destruction of his own dental enamel. The data, the language of Null, seemed to be transferring itself from the drives to him. As he ran his tongue over his now bleeding gums, tasting the coppery tang of his own broken body, he found a bizarre kind of peace. The world was being overwritten, and the metallic vibration was simply his body's necessary, painful boot-up sequence into the new system. The knowledge was consuming him, and he realized with terrifying clarity that the most frightening realization was not the loss of his sanity, but the acceptance that he was, at last, finally sane. Story 3. The Guardian of the Surface. The deepest, most profound horror is the willingness to protect others from a truth you can no longer outrun. By late Friday morning, almost precisely 72 hours after the central event in Reno, Police Constable Alistair Finch was thoroughly exhausted. The constant, low-grade fear and uncertainty of his last week of duty had curdled into the heavy procedural monotony of the daily police log. Ally was an empathetic man, and the strange calls had been piling up. The week before, he'd responded to the home of Mrs. Helen Vane, a wealthy, elderly resident of Hampstead High Street. Her complaint had been bizarre, a noise like a wine glass being struck, but inside the house's walls. He'd written it off as old pipes settling. 2 days later, Mrs. Vane called again, terrified because her beloved dog had spent 8 hours staring silently at a blank wall, unresponsive to his name. Allie's superior had rolled his eyes and told him to file it as an animal behavior query. He now had a new call. Mrs. Vane, the anonymous sender of the black drives, had been found dead in her drawing room by her cleaner. Suicide. Ally drove to the scene just past noon. The house was a quiet, suffocating monument to old money and fear. The coroner's team and 2 detectives were already there. As the senior detective handled the paperwork, Ally was tasked with the morbid duty of looking for any notes or final messages. He stood in the elegant drawing room, noting the expensive furnishings, the overwhelming silence, and the profound, cold stillness of the air. He found no note. He found only the uncanny details. The woman's dog, a small white terrier, was curled up in the corner of the room, still staring at the blank wall. On the mantelpiece, above a gas fire that had never been lit, stood a row of framed family photographs. Ally walked past them, his eyes scanning for clues. He stopped suddenly, scrawled in what looked like light gray chalk over the face of every single person in every single photo. The woman, her husband, her grandchildren, was a small, faint symbol, the 3-pronged glyph. It was the same mark he had seen spray-painted on a lamppost near Mrs. Vane's street only a few days before, a mark he had dismissed as meaningless graffiti. He knelt down and examined a small, ornate wooden box on a side table. Inside, tucked beneath a layer of old letters, he found 2 identical pieces of adhesive label paper. They were half shredded, matching the fragments Sarah had found in Reno, but these were fully intact. They were the shipping labels for the 3 parcels she had sent. The destination was not Veritas Data Solutions, but a cryptic, non-existent shell address. Mrs. Vane hadn't shipped data. She had shipped negation. She had been trying to get rid of the core truth that had invaded her familiar world. Ally backed out of the drawing room, his head ringing not with sound, but with pure comprehension. The shriek in Reno, Elias's vibrating teeth, the non-existent language, the dog staring at the wall, they were all symptoms of the same disease. Mrs. Vane hadn't been afraid of an intruder. She had been afraid of the silent, correct reality that had begun to assert itself in her home, the implausible double that replaces the familiar. He walked past the police photographer, who was calmly documenting the scene. He knew he had the key to the entire mystery, the human source, and the context, but he also knew his professional duty to report this truth. The etched symbol, the dog, the bizarre pattern of the shipping labels, would be to start the disintegration of the police force, the court system, and every stable law he swore to uphold. Ally walked to the police station's central records room and logged Mrs. Vane's death. He filed a report detailing the official version of events: suicide by hanging, no note found, and a prior history of anxiety, citing only the noise complaint and missing dog as minor context. He completely and deliberately omitted any mention of the chalk symbol or the shredded labels. He then looked at the stack of bizarre, unfiled reports on his desk, the vandalism, the strange noises, the fear complaints. He took the stack and filed them all under vandalism/no clear suspect, effectively burying the pattern. He had become the guardian of the surface world, the man who knew the lie and actively worked to maintain it. He walked out of the station doors, blinking in the late afternoon sun, and glanced across the street. There, parked illegally, was the dull gray van. The courier, the man in the gray van, sat silently inside, reading a book, his face a perfect mask of nothing. Allie looked at him, realizing the courier was now just a symbol, a walking blank spot, and he felt not fear, but a cold, final exhaustion. He knew that the silent man in the van was the perfect person to deliver the truth, because the truth itself was empty. The greatest weapon against the truth is the honest, overwhelming effort to make the lie seem plausible.